The air in the high valley tastes different. It's thinner, cleaner, and carries the scent of pine and wet stone. It's the same air my grandfather breathed when he stood on this very spot 100 years ago. I'm standing beside a massive cast-iron wheel, its surface a road map of rust and time. This wheel controls the emergency spillway for Willow Creek Lake. It's the master valve, the single point of failure for the entire glittering, multi-million-dollar resort that squats on the far shore. A resort owned and operated by the same man who, just this morning, thought it was a good idea to bulldoze my wife's memory for a better view from his new golf course. That man, Trent Kincaid, the new money developer currently playing God as our HOA president, is about to learn what a hydrologist can do with a century-old water charter and the cold, unforgiving power of gravity. I got home from the city a few hours ago. The first thing that hit me wasn't a sound, it was a void. A gaping hole in the landscape where my family's history used to be. The old barn, the one my grandfather built and my late wife, Clara, had been slowly, lovingly restoring, was gone. Not damaged, not in disrepair. Gone. In its place was a massive yellow excavator, parked in the middle of a fresh grave of splintered, century-old timber. A smirking goon in a polo shirt with a cheap compliance officer patch handed me a piece of paper. A blighted structures abatement order, he called it. An official-sounding piece of fiction designed to justify the desecration. The barn was more than wood. It was the last place I felt Clara's presence. I could still see her there, covered in sawdust, her face lit up with a joy that was purer than the mountain air, her hands carefully sanding down a beam my grandfather had set in place. It was her sanctuary, her project, her dream of breathing life back into our family's history, and Kincaid had pulverized it. He'd turned her dream into a pile of garbage because it blocked the view for his wealthy clientele. The order cited aesthetic code violations and imminent structural collapse, a lie so brazen it was almost impressive. I knelt in the wreckage, my hand resting on a massive hand-hewn support beam. I could still feel the faint grooves of my grandfather's adze, the marks of a man who built things to last forever. Kincaid had destroyed something that had survived blizzards, floods, and the Great Depression, all with a single, arrogant stroke of a pen. He thought he was fighting a grieving widower over a dilapidated barn. He had no idea he was in a war with the grandson of the man who designed and built this entire water system. He didn't just break a bylaw, he broke a sacred promise I made to my wife before she died. And Clara taught me you never, ever let that stand. Kincaid has just made a multi-million-dollar mistake. And now, the whole world is about to watch his prized lakefront paradise turn into a muddy, desolate wasteland. To understand the promise I made to Clara, you need to understand where I come from. It's a story written in hydrology charts and reinforced concrete, a legacy of taming rivers and building things that last. Before I was a widower trying to restore a barn, I was a lead hydrologist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For 20 years, my job was to go to the most unstable places in the world and impose order on the most powerful force of nature, water. I designed flood control systems for forward operating bases in monsoon zones where the ground turned to liquid mud. I calculated the structural integrity of dams in hostile territories, structures that provided power and life to entire regions. I wasn't just an engineer in an office. I was on the ground, analyzing soil composition, predicting catastrophic failure points, and managing the complex, often deadly, physics of water under pressure. My entire career was about understanding how water systems work, how to control them, and how to protect them from those who would exploit them. That expertise wasn't just learned, it was inherited. My family didn't just settle in this valley, we built it. My grandfather, William Bridger, was a civil engineer with a visionary streak. In the early 1920 seconds, he looked at the wild, unpredictable Willow Creek and saw not a threat, but a future. He designed and personally supervised the construction of the dam that created the lake, transforming a flood-prone valley into a thriving community. He wasn't a developer looking for a profit. He was a pioneer, a man who believed in building things for the next generation. He partnered with the county, using his own money and expertise to create the water system that every home and business here, including Trent Kincaid's gaudy resort, still depends on to this day. His authority was earned with sweat, steel, and a deep understanding of the land. That barn Kincaid demolished was the heart of that legacy. It was the original engineering office, the command center from which my grandfather ran the entire dam project. After he passed, it became a kind of family museum, a quiet testament to a man who built things that endured. And then, it became Clara's dream. My late wife was a passionate environmentalist, a woman who saw beauty in the land's natural state. She hated the manicured, sterile lawns of the new resort. She loved the old barn, the historic creek, the land as it was meant to be. She saw the beauty in the original, hand-hewn timber and the history etched into the workshop floor. She was slowly, meticulously restoring it, not to turn it into a monument, but to make it a living piece of history, a community space for art and local heritage. Before she passed, I sat by her bed, held her hand, and I promised her I would finish it. I promised her that her dream wouldn't die with her. The demolition wasn't just the destruction of a building. It was the violation of a sacred vow. Our family's authority over this place isn't just a story. It's a matter of public record. In the center of the town square, there's a bronze plaque, weathered by decades of mountain winters, bolted to a large granite boulder. It was dedicated in 1950. It reads, "In honor of William Bridger, the visionary engineer whose taming of Willow Creek in 1924 gave life and prosperity to this valley. His legacy flows in the water that sustains us all." Trent Kincaid probably walked past that plaque every day on his way to his favorite coffee shop and never once bothered to read it. He saw the lake as a commodity, a backdrop for his resort. He never understood that he was just a guest in a house my family had built. The conflict started a year ago, right after Kincaid finished the first phase of his resort. He was a brash, loud, new money developer who saw our quiet valley as an untapped market. He approached me with his team of lawyers, not with a request, but with a demand. He wanted a new easement to reroute the historic creek that runs through my property. He wanted to divert it, to turn my grandfather's carefully engineered waterway into a decorative feature for his new golf course. He called the creek an inefficient drainage ditch and talked about modernizing the watershed's flow. He saw a natural ecosystem, a living piece of my family's history, and he wanted to turn it into a plumbing fixture. I refused. I told him the creek was part of the original dam design, and that its natural course was essential to the valley's ecological balance. I told him it was a promise I had made to my late wife. He didn't hear a word I said. He just saw an obstacle. His smile, which was all teeth and no warmth, vanished. "This is a prime development opportunity, Bridger," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And this valley is ready for progress. You can either be a part of it, or you can get run over by it. Cooperate, or the HOA will find a way to condemn that eyesore of a barn and take the land. Anyway, progress is coming to this valley, with or without you." It was a declaration of war. He thought it was a threat that would make me fold. He had no idea it was the moment I started building a case against him. After Kincaid's threat, I started my own reconnaissance. In the core, before you assault an objective, you build a complete intelligence picture of the enemy's command structure. I needed to understand the machine he had built to enforce his will. Trent Kincaid wasn't your typical HOA president. He was a brash, new money developer who had bought the old Willow Creek Lodge and transformed it into a flashy, high-end resort. Then, in a stroke of predatory genius, he'd used his influence and a flood of proxy votes from his new resort properties to get himself elected president of the Homeowners Association. He didn't do it out of some sense of civic duty. He did it to seize control. The HOA wasn't a community organization anymore. It had become the enforcement arm of his development company. His arrogance was loud and unapologetic. He talked about disrupting the valley's stagnant culture and optimizing its aesthetic assets. He saw the long-time residents, the families who had been here for generations, as legacy obstacles to his grand vision of a perfectly polished, exclusive mountain getaway. His weapon was the Architectural Review Committee, which he chaired personally. He used it to wage a war of aesthetic compliance against anyone who didn't fit his modern luxury brand. I started talking to my neighbors, the ones who hadn't yet been scared into silence, and the stories painted a grim picture. He went after Old Man Hemlock first. Hemlock, a retired fisherman, had a small, simple boat dock that had been on the lake for 50 years. Kincaid's committee declared it a Class A aesthetic violation because, according to the official notice, it cluttered the resort's premium lakefront sightlines. He didn't just fine him, he used a safety bylaw he'd pushed through the month before to have the dock physically torn down, then sent Hemlock the bill for the demolition. Then there were the Patels, a young family who had planted a sprawling, beautiful vegetable garden. Kincaid's HOA cited them for failure to maintain a manicured lawn consistent with community luxury standards. He was trying to fine a family for growing their own food because it didn't look as neat as a golf course. His power wasn't just confined to the HOA. It extended into the county government. He had a crony on the county planning commission, a man named Davies, who fast-tracked every permit Kincaid needed, no matter how questionable. In return, Kincaid's development company made substantial donations to Davies's re-election campaign fund. It was bribery, laundered through the political system, and it gave Kincaid the cover he needed to operate with impunity. He had built a fortress of corruption, protected by bylaws he wrote himself and permits approved by a man on his payroll. His campaign against me was a calculated, multi-stage assault designed to break me or bankrupt me. It started with the formal demand for the easement to reroute the creek. When I refused, the paper siege began. A relentless barrage of official-looking violation notices started arriving, all targeting the barn. First, it was a notice of aesthetic non-compliance, claiming the barn's weathered wood was inconsistent with the HOA's approved color palette. The fine was $500. I ignored it. A week later, a structural integrity warning arrived, claiming the barn was a safety hazard, complete with a report from an engineering firm I'd never heard of. The fine was $2,000. He was trying to bury me in a blizzard of paperwork, to make fighting him so exhausting and so expensive that I would eventually give up and grant him the easement just to make it stop. When that didn't work, he made his final, decisive move. He had his puppet, Commissioner Davies, quietly push through a new county ordinance related to blighted structures. The ordinance, which was written by Kincaid's own lawyers, gave the HOA the authority to abate any structure deemed a risk to the community's property values. It was a fraudulent, self-serving piece of legislation, a legal tool custom-built for the sole purpose of destroying my barn. A week after the ordinance passed, he sent the excavator. He didn't just want to demolish the barn, he wanted to legally justify it, to wrap his act of vandalism in the flag of civic duty. I knew a simple lawsuit for damages wouldn't be enough. Kincaid controlled the local system. He had the planning commission in his pocket, and he had the bylaws on his side, no matter how corrupt their origin. I couldn't fight him on his home turf. I needed to escalate. I needed to take the fight to a battlefield he couldn't control. He thought he had the law on his side because he had a crooked commissioner. He forgot about a higher authority. He forgot about the Environmental Protection Agency. The game changed. I wasn't fighting an HOA anymore. I was auditing a federal crime in progress. Kincaid had made this a war of paper, of permits and bylaws. He just didn't realize he had picked a fight with a man who had spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, a man for whom navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy was a core competency. The county records office is a dusty, forgotten place for most people, filled with brittle paper and the smell of decay. For a hydrologist, it's a library of ammunition. I spent the next 2 days there, not as a grieving landowner, but as an investigator, methodically pulling every deed, charter, and plat map related to the Willow Creek watershed dating back to the late 1800 seconds. On the afternoon of the second day, I found it. Tucked away in a heavy leather-bound folio labeled County Water and Power, 1920 to 1930, was the document that would become my weapon. The original 1924 Willow Creek Water Charter. It was a masterpiece of old-world engineering and legal foresight, co-signed by my grandfather, William Bridger, and the 3 county commissioners of the era. The charter didn't just authorize the construction of the dam. It laid out the operational protocols for the entire watershed in perpetuity. And there, on page 12, in clear, unambiguous language, was the clause that made my heart pound. It stipulated that the owner of the parcel of land where the primary dam controls were located, my land would forever hold the title of Watermaster, a position granting ultimate and unimpeachable authority over the operation of the emergency spillway and all related sluice gates in times of perceived structural risk or for the purposes of mandatory system inspection. It was an ace in the hole, a piece of legal authority from a bygone era that Kincaid, in his arrogant rush to modernize, had never even thought to look for. He had focused on the HOA's bylaws, the new rules he could write and manipulate. He never considered the old ones, the ones carved into the county's very foundation. Alongside the charter, I found my grandfather's original, hand-drawn dam schematics. They were beautiful, detailed blueprints that showed not just the main dam, but the entire network he had designed, including the old, forgotten emergency spillway, a secondary channel designed to divert the entire creek flow away from the lake and back into its original, natural course down the far side of the valley. A system that had been sealed off for 50 years but was, according to the plans, still fully operational. I now had the legal authority and the technical blueprint for my counterattack. But I wasn't done. Draining his lake would be a satisfying act of revenge, but it wasn't the kill shot. For that, I needed to go after Kincaid himself. I moved my investigation from the dusty archives to the digital battlefield. As a former Corps engineer, I knew that any major development project, especially one that impacts a waterway, has to go through a rigorous permitting process with the state's Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP. I logged onto the state's public permit database and searched for Kincaid's Phase 2 expansion. And there it was. A thick, 300-page file containing every permit, every survey, and every study he had submitted. I spent an entire night reading through it, and the further I got, the colder my rage became. The entire project was built on a foundation of fraud. The centerpiece of his permit application was a so-called environmental impact study, a document that is supposed to be a sacred, unbiased assessment of a project's effect on the local ecosystem. His was a work of fiction. It claimed the historic creek on my property was an intermittent drainage ditch with no significant ecological value. It completely ignored the fact that the stream was a federally protected waterway, a critical habitat for a native species of trout. It falsified the watershed's hydrology data, underreporting the stream's flow rate by a factor of 10 to make it seem insignificant. It was a clear, prosecutable violation of the Federal Clean Water Act, a crime that came with multi-million-dollar fines and federal prison time. I spent the next 48 hours building a kill package. I wasn't a grieving husband anymore. I was a federal investigator building a case. Every document was scanned, annotated, and cross-referenced. I created a timeline, linking Kincaid's fraudulent permit applications to his campaign of harassment against me. I compiled the evidence into a single, damning report. The original 1,924 Watermaster Charter, proving my legal authority. My grandfather's dam schematics providing the technical means. Kincaid's fraudulent environmental study proving his criminal intent, and a copy of the Federal Clean Water Act, with the specific statutes he had violated, highlighted in bright red. Kincaid thought he had won by knocking down a building. I had just found the evidence to dismantle his entire financial empire and send him to prison. He was about to host a big press conference to celebrate his Phase 2 expansion. He'd invited every news outlet in the state to his prized resort on the shore of his beautiful lake. I decided it was the perfect time to conduct a little emergency maintenance on the dam. He wanted to be famous. I was about to make him infamous. Trent Kincaid stood at a podium draped in the logo of his resort, the picture of a visionary captain of industry. Behind him, his prized lake glittered under the afternoon sun, a perfect, sapphire backdrop for his victory speech. He'd invited every major news outlet in the state to celebrate the launch of his Phase 2 expansion, the glorious new golf course and luxury villas that would soon be built on the ashes of my family's history. He was beaming, a conquering hero announcing a new era of prosperity for the valley, a prosperity built on his own ruthless ambition. He had no idea he was delivering a eulogy for his own empire. I was 2 miles away, standing in the cool, damp air of the old dam control house, a small stone building my grandfather had built with his own hands. In front of me was the massive cast-iron wheel of the emergency spillway, a piece of century-old engineering that hadn't been turned in 50 years. I gripped its cold, rusted surface, my knuckles white. This wasn't just an act of revenge. It was an act of restoration. I was about to return the water to its rightful, natural course, the one Kincaid had tried to erase from the maps and from memory. Every turn of that wheel was a tribute to my grandfather's genius and a final, loving act of service for my wife. I wasn't just draining a lake, I was correcting a wrong. I put my shoulder into it and began to turn. Back at the resort, Kincaid was in the middle of a sentence about sustainable luxury when the first sign of trouble began. It was a low, grinding, metallic groan that echoed from across the lake, a sound so ancient and so powerful it cut right through the polite applause. A few reporters looked up, confused. Kincaid faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, before continuing with his speech. Then, the resort's iconic, multi-tiered fountains, the centerpiece of its grand entrance, began to sputter. The elegant arcs of water faltered, coughed, and then died, leaving a pathetic trickle running down the sides of the expensive stonework. The crowd began to murmur. That's when they noticed the lake. The water level, which had been lapping peacefully at the edge of the resort's pristine, man-made beach, was now visibly receding. At first, it was just a few inches, revealing a dark, wet line of sand. Then it was a foot. Then 3. A collective gasp went through the crowd as a 100-foot-wide expanse of ugly, slick mud began to appear, the water pulling back with an unnatural speed. The beautiful sapphire lake was bleeding out. Panic began to ripple through the reporters and the wealthy guests. Kincaid's perfectly staged press conference was dissolving into a scene of chaotic disbelief. His face, which had been beaming with triumph, was now a mask of pure, uncomprehending rage. He knew. Somehow, he knew this was my doing. He abandoned the podium, screaming my name, and jumped into a golf cart, tearing off toward the old dam road. He found me standing by the spillway controls, the great wheel now fully turned, a torrent of water roaring through the newly opened channel, bypassing the lake entirely. The sound was deafening, the raw, untamed power of the river unleashed. Kincaid leaped from the cart before it had even stopped, his face a blotchy, apoplectic red. "What the hell have you done, Bridger?" he screamed over the roar of the water. I didn't shout back. I didn't need to. I held up the plastic-sleeved document I had been waiting to show him. It was a certified copy of the 1924 Willow Creek Water Charter. "I'm exercising my family's legal authority," I stated, my voice calm and clear, cutting right through his rage. "As the designated water master for this system, as stipulated in this charter, which was co-signed by the county and my grandfather, I am conducting a mandatory emergency inspection of the dam's primary and secondary structures." Kincaid stared at the document, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and confusion. "Watermaster, that's insane. That's not a real thing." "It is when it's been the law of this county for the last 100 years, I replied. "The charter grants me the unimpeachable authority to drain the reservoir to assess its structural integrity. And given the unpermitted, illegal construction you've been doing on its shoreline, I have every reason to believe that integrity has been compromised. The lake has to be drained. You should have read the fine print before you bulldozed my wife's memory." For the first time in his life, Trent Kincaid was speechless. The weapon he had used against everyone, the fine print, the rules, the regulations had just been turned against him with devastating force. He had been so focused on the new laws he could write that he never bothered to check the old ones he couldn't. He finally found his voice, a ragged, desperate snarl. "I'll sue you into the Stone Age. I'll have you arrested for sabotage. You've destroyed my property." "No," I said, my voice like ice. "You destroyed my property. You destroyed my wife's legacy. I'm just lowering the water level." He was about to lunge at me when my phone rang. The sound was jarring in the middle of the roaring water and Kincaid's rage. I looked at the caller ID. It was a Washington, D.C. number. I answered and put it on speaker. The voice on the other end was grim, professional, and held the unmistakable weight of federal authority. "Mr. Bridger," the voice said. "This is Agent Evans with the Environmental Protection Agency. We've received your evidence package. The fraudulent permits, the violation of the Clean Water Act. We have it all. We have a joint task force on the way. Do not let Mr. Kincaid leave the premises. He is now the subject of a federal investigation." I looked at Kincaid. The color had drained from his face. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, primal terror. He wasn't a developer anymore. He wasn't an HOA president. He was a cornered criminal, a man who had just heard the sound of the cage door slamming shut. The trap had been sprung, and the full weight of the United States government was about to come crashing down on him. The arrival of the EPA was the beginning of the end. Kincaid was no longer my problem. He was a federal asset to be secured. My role in the conflict shifted instantly. I was no longer the lone landowner fighting for his rights. I was the primary expert witness in a multi-agency federal investigation. Agent Evans and a team from the state's Department of Environmental Protection arrived within the hour. It was a professional, overwhelming presence. They didn't come to argue or negotiate. They came to secure a crime scene. They immediately took Kincaid into custody for questioning, separating him from his lawyers and his influence. His reign was over. The systematic dismantling of his empire had just begun. I spent the next 2 days leading Agent Evans and the DEP chief on a tour of the entire watershed. With my grandfather's original dam schematics in hand, I became their guide, their operational expert. I showed them exactly where Kincaid's unpermitted construction for his golf course had illegally altered the historic creek bed, causing significant erosion and threatening the stability of the entire hillside. I walked them through his fraudulent environmental impact studies line by line, pointing out the falsified hydrology data and the deliberate omission of the federally protected stream. I wasn't just pointing at the damage. I was showing them the violations in their own rulebook, chapter and verse. I was speaking their language, and they were listening. The first official act of retaliation was a sight to behold. A federal agent, accompanied by 2 armed deputies, marched onto Kincaid's celebrated development site and hammered a massive, blood-red stop work order sign into the ground, right in front of the half-finished clubhouse. All construction, all activity, ceased immediately. Then came the fines. The EPA, armed with my evidence of willful violations of the Clean Water Act, hit Kincaid and his development company with a series of crippling, 6-figure daily fines, retroactive to the day his illegal construction began. It wasn't a penalty. It was a financial execution. The news of the federal investigation and the draining lake hit the financial world like a tsunami. Kincaid's investors, who had been promised a high-return, low-risk luxury development, now saw a toxic asset, a quagmire of federal litigation and environmental disaster. They panicked. The funding for the project was pulled overnight. His partners, in a desperate attempt to distance themselves from the impending legal firestorm, filed their own multi-million-dollar lawsuits against him for fraud and gross misrepresentation. His corporate allies didn't just abandon him. They turned on him, eager to offer him up as a sacrifice to save themselves. The investigation quickly consumed the local corruption that had enabled Kincaid's reign. The paper trail from the fraudulent permits led directly to the county planning commissioner, Davies. Faced with a federal subpoena and the testimony of his own staff, Davies crumbled. He resigned in disgrace and was soon facing his own criminal investigation for accepting bribes and conspiring to defraud the county. The entire corrupt power structure that Kincaid had built to protect himself was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Kincaid, facing financial ruin, public humiliation, and the prospect of decades in federal prison, made bail. And then he vanished. For a day, there was silence. I thought maybe he had fled, become a fugitive. But then, while I was doing a final inspection of my own property line, I found it. Nailed to the gatepost where his first fraudulent notice had been, was a copy of his personal bankruptcy filing. It was an admission of defeat. But just beyond it, in the soft dirt of the access road leading to the main dam, I saw fresh tracks. The deep, unmistakable treads of a backhoe and other heavy machinery. My blood ran cold. He wasn't running. He was planning one last, insane act of spite. He wasn't trying to save his project anymore. He was trying to destroy the entire valley out of pure, nihilistic rage. He was going to try and break the dam. Kincaid had started this by destroying my family's history. He was about to end it by trying to destroy the entire community's future. I had started this fight to protect a memory. Now I had to finish it to prevent a catastrophe. There was no time for a plan. No time for a strategy. This was a crisis, a potential catastrophe in the making, and I was the only one who truly understood the stakes. I made 2 calls as I sprinted to my truck. The first was to the sheriff's department. The second to Agent Evans at the EPA. My message was the same for both. Kincaid is at the main dam with heavy equipment. He's trying to breach it. Get here now. I didn't wait for their response. They wouldn't get there in time. I knew that dam better than any man alive. I knew its stress points, its failure tolerances, and I knew that a man as ignorant and as blinded by rage as Trent Kincaid could cause a catastrophic failure in a matter of minutes. I arrived at the dam to a scene of organized chaos. Kincaid had a backhoe clawing at the earth near the base of the main spillway, trying to undermine its foundation. He wasn't thinking like an engineer. He was thinking like a cornered animal, lashing out at the thing that had caged him. He was trying to unleash a flood that would not only destroy his own resort, but could potentially threaten the entire town downstream. I didn't confront him directly. I went for his weapon, the backhoe operator. "Hey," I shouted, my voice carrying over the groan of the machinery. "You in the cab. Do you have any idea what the hydraulic pressure is on that spillway gate? You keep digging there, and you're going to trigger a flash flood that will take out every bridge for the next 50 miles. The operator paused, looking from me to a screaming Kincaid. "He's lying," Kincaid shrieked. "Keep digging! Ask him for the engineering report," I yelled. "Ask him if he's done a soil stability analysis. You are about to cause a state of emergency, and you will be held criminally liable." That was the moment the sheriff's cruisers and the federal SUVs came roaring up the access road, lights flashing. The sight of a dozen armed officers and federal agents descending on the scene was enough. The backhoe operator killed the engine and put his hands in the air. Kincaid's last desperate act of spite was over. They arrested him on the spot. The charge wasn't sabotage or fraud this time. It was environmental terrorism. The victory after that was absolute. Trent Kincaid, facing a mountain of evidence and decades in federal prison, was convicted. He was forced to liquidate every asset he owned to pay the massive federal fines and the settlement from my own civil suit. He didn't just lose his resort, he lost everything. His name became a cautionary tale in the valley, a synonym for greed and hubris. With Kincaid gone, the HOA board, facing a massive class action lawsuit from the residents they had terrorized, resigned in disgrace. The organization was dismantled, its bylaws rewritten, and its power returned to the homeowners. I used the settlement money not to enrich myself, but to honor the two things Kincaid had tried to destroy: my family's legacy and my wife's memory. I hired a team of artisan builders, and using my grandfather's original plans and salvaged timber, we rebuilt the barn, piece by piece, exactly as Clara had designed it. But I didn't stop there. I worked with the state's Department of Environmental Protection and a local land trust, and I used the rest of the money to have the historic creek and the entire surrounding watershed designated as a permanent, protected nature preserve in my wife's name, the Clara Bridger Memorial Preserve. The final scene was the grand opening of the rebuilt barn, which was now a small community center and a museum dedicated to the valley's history and my wife's environmental advocacy. The entire community was there. Old Man Hemlock, his fishing dock rebuilt. The Patel family, their vegetable garden now a source of pride for the whole neighborhood. Kincaid's reign of terror was a distant memory. The guest of honor was Agent Evans from the EPA, who presented the community with a plaque recognizing the new preserve. I stood in the doorway of the completed barn, the scent of fresh-cut cedar and pine filling the air, and looked out at the protected, free-flowing creek. The lake, now managed by a community trust, was slowly refilling, clean and clear. My wife's dream was real. My family's legacy as protectors was secure. Kincaid saw this land as a commodity to be bought and sold. He never understood that some things a promise to a wife, a duty to a grandfather, the water itself don't have a price tag. He wanted to own the lake. In the end, the only thing he owns is a prison cell.